It was one of those nights where everything seemed ordinary at first, and then slowly, inch by inch, the atmosphere shifted into something utterly unexplainable. The kind of night that you replay in your head over and over, trying to make sense of what you saw, what you felt, when nothing seems to add up. We had gathered for an after party in an old townhouse in the center of the city, a place rented by my friend Lucas for the weekend. The apartment itself wasn't much, cramped, 2 floors with creaky wooden floors and peeling wallpaper, but it had character, and that was why Lucas loved it. He'd found it cheap and said it reminded him of the place where his grandmother grew up. The whole building was kind of a relic, built back in the 1920s, and it had a history with the neighborhood that some locals whispered about. Nothing too scary, just typical old house stories. You know the type. The night began like most parties do. Loud music, crowded rooms, lots of laughter, and drinks. We were about 15 of us, mostly people from college and work. The plan was simple: celebrate the end of the semester and just forget about responsibilities for a while. People came and went, the living room packed, the kitchen turned into a makeshift bar. Everyone was relaxed, joking, dancing, making dumb impressions of professors or bosses. Around midnight, the energy started to dip, and people began leaving in small groups. By 1 a.m., only a handful of us were left: Lucas, me, Sarah, and a few others. The music was quieter, more ambient, and the conversation slowed to whispers. At some point, Lucas suggested we check out the rooftop. The building had a narrow spiral staircase leading to it, and he said the view was incredible on a clear night. I didn't want to go at first. I'm not great with heights, but curiosity won out. We climbed the stairs, the narrow metal steps creaking under our weight. When we reached the rooftop, the city spread out before us in all directions, glittering lights, the distant hum of traffic, and the cool night air brushing over us. For a while, it was peaceful. We smoked, talked about the future, about our dreams, and the things we feared. The city seemed so alive and so far away from our small worries. But then, Sarah pointed out something odd. "Hey, do you guys see that light down there?" I followed her gaze to the neighboring rooftop across the street. At first, I didn't see anything, but then a faint glow appeared, like a lantern or candle, flickering behind a dirty window. "It's weird that someone's up there," Lucas said. "That building's supposed to be abandoned." We joked about ghosts, as you do. The idea of an abandoned building being occupied by spirits was a cliché, but the dim light made it real somehow. Then the light disappeared. Suddenly, a cold wind whipped around us, not just a breeze, an unnatural chill that cut through our clothes. The hair on my arms stood on end. "Maybe we should head back," I said, already feeling uneasy. As we descended, the mood shifted. The hallway inside was darker than before, the usual hum of the city replaced by an eerie silence. I swear I heard footsteps behind us, slow and deliberate, but every time I turned, no one was there. Back in the apartment, Sarah said she felt watched all night. Lucas laughed it off, but I caught the tension in his voice. Around 2 a.m., things took a turn for the worse. The power flickered. At first, just a quick dimming of the lights, then a full blackout. Phones lit up the rooms in weak glows, and the sound of whispered voices filled the silence, soft, overlapping murmurs that no one could quite make out. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the kitchen. We rushed in to find the window open, despite all the doors and windows having been locked. Outside, the street was empty. Sarah insisted she saw a shadowy figure standing just beyond the glass, watching us. Lucas tried to keep everyone calm. "It's probably someone messing around, trying to scare us." But none of us believed it. The knocking started next, rhythmic, coming from inside the walls. We all froze, staring at the cracked plaster, imagining something tapping just beyond. Then, one by one, things began to disappear. Sarah's jacket vanished from the couch. Lucas's phone went missing. My keys disappeared from my pocket. No one admitted taking anything, and none of us could find the items anywhere. The temperature dropped sharply. Our breath fogged in front of us. The whispering grew louder, almost chanting. I saw movement in the corner of my eye, a figure, translucent, drifting across the hallway. When I blinked, it vanished. Panic set in. Some people tried calling taxis. Others wanted to leave immediately. But the front door, locked only minutes before, wouldn't open. The knob spun freely, but the door stayed shut. We heard footsteps coming from the upper floor, heavy, slow, deliberate. Lucas called out, but no one answered. Suddenly, Sarah screamed. We rushed upstairs to find her staring at the attic door at the end of the hall. The door, which had been closed earlier, now stood wide open. Inside, nothing but darkness. Lucas grabbed a flashlight and peered in. A cold, oppressive feeling overwhelmed us. The beam caught something, a silhouette standing still in the corner. It was a man, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes staring directly at us. He did not blink. We stumbled back, heart pounding, breath ragged. The door slammed shut on its own, and the attic went silent. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, too afraid to sleep, too terrified to leave. When dawn finally came, the front door unlocked by itself. We ran out and didn't look back. Lucas never returned to the apartment. Sarah and I tried to forget the night, but the shadows followed us. Weeks later, I learned the building across the street had been empty for years. Its last resident died in a fire decades ago. No lights, no occupants, and sometimes, when I'm alone, I still hear the knocking and see a pale figure watching from the dark. Story the end. It was a typical spring weekend, the kind that everyone looked forward to after a grueling semester. The kind where the sun sets late, the air smells fresh with blossoms, and the nights stretch out wide with possibilities. Our group of friends decided to throw one last party before everyone scattered for the summer. The kind of after party that started with a few close people and spiraled into something wild. The setting was an old house on the edge of town, a place with enough history to inspire rumors, but isolated enough for us to do whatever we wanted without the cops showing up. The house had been empty for months before we rented it for the weekend. It was an old Victorian, 2 stories, with peeling wallpaper, creaky floorboards, and a dark attic no one dared to explore. The previous owner was said to have disappeared years ago, though no one knew the exact story. Local kids whispered about strange noises and flickering lights. But those were just stories, or so we thought. By the time people started arriving, it was early evening. The house filled quickly with laughter, music, and the smell of cheap beer and pizza. The main floor was chaotic. Some danced wildly in the living room, others sprawled on threadbare couches, and a few clustered near the kitchen, trading stories and mixing drinks. Upstairs, the bedrooms were quickly commandeered by people looking for privacy, and the attic door remained shut tight, the source of many dares throughout the night. I was there with 4 of my closest friends, Lisa, Tom, Sarah, and Jake. We had been through a lot together, and this party was our way of marking the end of a chapter. Lisa was the first to notice something strange. It started with the lights flickering. At first, it was subtle. A quick blink here, a brief dim there. The old house probably just needed new wiring, we joked. But as the night deepened, the flickering grew worse, until the power cut out completely. The music died. Phones lit up in confusion. We were plunged into silence. Someone groaned. Then a different sound echoed through the dark. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the attic. No one had gone up there since we'd arrived. We stood frozen, eyes adjusting to the soft glow of the candles scattered around the room. Lisa whispered that she didn't want to go upstairs alone, but curiosity got the better of us. Jake grabbed a flashlight, and the 5 of us crept toward the staircase. As we climbed, the air grew colder, heavier, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. At the top, the attic door was slightly open, creaking softly with each breath of wind. We pushed it wider, revealing a small, cluttered space filled with old furniture, dusty boxes, and a single rocking chair, slowly moving back and forth despite no breeze. We shone the flashlight around, trying to make sense of the eerie motion. Then, from the corner, a faint whisper floated out. "Get out." It was barely audible, but unmistakably human. Sarah gasped and grabbed my arm. We turned to leave, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The room plunged into darkness. The flashlight flickered and died. We were trapped. Panic set in. I banged on the door, shouting for help, but the only response was that chilling whisper again, closer this time. "Leave." Suddenly, the rocking chair stopped. Silence. The door creaked, then slowly opened. We spilled out of the attic and ran downstairs, hearts pounding. Outside, the party was gone. The music had stopped. The front yard was empty. Our phones had no signal. No cars were parked. It was like the house had swallowed everything whole. We tried calling out to people, but only our echoes answered. Then we heard footsteps on the porch, slow, heavy, coming toward us. We turned to see a figure standing in the shadows. A woman. Her dress was soaked, clinging to her pale skin. Her hair hung in wet strands over her face. Her eyes empty, no pupils, just dark holes. She reached out her hand. "Help me." We screamed and ran into the woods behind the house, not stopping until the house was a distant silhouette against the dawn. The next day, police found no signs of the party. No trash, no broken furniture, no people. It was as if no one had ever been there. Weeks later, Lisa found an old newspaper clipping in the town archives. A woman named Eleanor had drowned in that very house decades ago, trapped during a storm in the attic by a jealous lover. Her body was never found. And every year, locals reported strange noises and flickering lights in the empty house. We never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear the creak of that rocking chair. And a whisper on the wind, "Help me." Story the end. The party started innocently enough. Drew had just moved into the old house on the edge of campus, a sprawling two-story Victorian with creaky floorboards and drafty windows. His friends teased him about living in a haunted house, but Drew just laughed it off. "Old houses have character," he said. It was Halloween weekend, and the buzz around campus was that Drew's place would be the go-to spot. People were eager to blow off steam before finals left, and his invitation was open to anyone who wanted to come. The crowd was a mix of students from all years, some dressed up, some not. Loud music, cheap beer, and the smell of cigarettes filled the air. I arrived just after 9 with Maddie and Sergio, both of them clearly hyped but trying to act chill. The house was already packed, music pumping from the speakers set up in the living room. People were dancing, drinking, and the general mood was wild but fun. The basement was open, converted into a makeshift dance floor, while upstairs bedrooms were filled with smaller groups talking or hooking up. I didn't know many people there, but that wasn't unusual. At parties like this, you didn't need to. At first, everything felt normal. The usual chaos of a college party, spilled drinks, people stumbling over the stairs, laughter. Drew was working the crowd, making sure everyone had a drink, trying to keep things from getting out of hand. The place creaked and groaned in that way old houses do, but nobody seemed to care. By midnight, the crowd had thinned out. Some people had passed out, others wandered off into the night. I was leaning against the kitchen counter when I noticed Maddie had gone quiet. She was staring at the hallway that led upstairs, her eyes wide. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I listened. At first, I thought it was the music from the living room echoing up the stairs, but then I realized it was something else. Faint tapping, like nails clicking on wood. We exchanged a look and moved toward the stairs. The tapping stopped as soon as we got close. "Probably just someone messing around," Sergio said, but he didn't sound convinced. The air grew colder as we went upstairs. It wasn't just a draft, it was sharp, like the chill had teeth. I wrapped my arms around myself, feeling a prickling at the back of my neck. We pushed open the door to one of the bedrooms, a room that had been used for quiet conversation earlier in the night. It was empty, but the window was slightly open. The curtain fluttered even though there was no breeze. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind us. I jumped and spun around, but the door was locked tight. "Guys, this isn't funny," Maddie said, pounding on the door. No response from downstairs. We banged on the door, yelling, but nobody heard us. The lights flickered and then went out, plunging the room into darkness. My phone flashlight barely pierced the blackness, and I noticed shapes moving just beyond the beam, shadows that didn't belong to any of us. Then came the whispering. Soft, almost like a chant, growing louder and closer. The voices seemed to circle us, coming from every direction. "Who's there?" Sergio called out, his voice shaking. No answer, just the whispering, and the tapping resumed, faster this time, more urgent. Suddenly, a cold hand grabbed my wrist. I yanked it away and turned, but there was nothing there. Maddie gasped and pointed toward the corner. The shadows there coalesced into a vague human shape, pale, indistinct, but unmistakably there. It moved toward us, gliding over the floor. We backed away, panic rising. Then the windows slammed shut, shattering the fragile silence. I screamed, and the shadows scattered like smoke. The door unlocked with a click. We bolted out into the hallway, hearts pounding. The rest of the house was eerily quiet. No music, no talking, no footsteps. We called out for Drew and the others, but only silence answered. We made our way downstairs, and the front door was wide open. Outside, the fog had thickened, swallowing the porch light and creeping down the street like a living thing. We hesitated, but knew we couldn't stay. As we stepped out, I glanced back at the house. For a brief moment, I thought I saw someone, or something, standing at the top of the stairs watching us leave. The next morning, Drew was reported missing. The police searched the house but found no sign of him or the others who had stayed late. Some say the house is cursed, haunted by something ancient that wakes when the parties end. I don't know what we saw that night. I don't want to. But sometimes when I'm alone and the lights flicker, I swear I hear the tapping again. Story, the end. The night had started like any other. Our group of friends, about a dozen of us, had gathered to celebrate the end of finals at Jenna's new apartment. Jenna had just moved into a spacious old building downtown that she'd gotten for a steal. The place was perfect for a party. Exposed brick walls, a huge living room, and tall windows that overlooked the city skyline. The air was electric with excitement. People arrived in waves, carrying bottles, snacks, and their best party vibes. The music was loud but not overpowering, and the crowd flowed easily between the living room and the kitchen. Laughter bounced off the walls, drinks were poured freely, and the night stretched ahead, full of promise. We were all exhausted from the semester, but buzzing with the anticipation of freedom. Conversations overlapped, stories were shared, and for a few hours, the worries of life disappeared. I remember thinking how perfect the night was, the kind of night you want to freeze in time. As the party wound down past midnight, the crowd had thinned. Most of the guests had left or found quiet corners to crash. Jenna, a few close friends, and I remained. The music was turned down low, and the conversation took a more intimate turn, drifting to memories and plans for the summer. Jenna's apartment had an old-school charm, but with it came quirks. The wiring was a little unstable, so flickering lights weren't unusual. The heating system was ancient, and every now and then the floorboards creaked underfoot in ways that sounded almost like footsteps. We joked about it, laughed it off, and told ghost stories to scare each other. At about 2:30 a.m., the power cut out. It was sudden and complete. Everything plunged into darkness, and for a moment the only sounds were hushed gasps and the soft murmur of confusion. Jenna swore she'd seen the lights dim for a few seconds before going out entirely. "No big deal," someone said, lighting a candle. "Probably the building's wiring again." But the power didn't come back on. We lit more candles, pulling them from the kitchen and the bathrooms. The flickering flames cast long shadows across the walls, giving the apartment a spooky, unreal atmosphere. The shadows danced in the corners, seeming to flicker in and out of existence. Jenna tried calling the building management, but got no answer. Cell reception was spotty in the building, and soon our phones started losing signal. The apartment, usually alive with the city's hum, now felt eerily silent, except for the occasional creak or groan of the old building settling. We clustered in the living room, candles on the coffee table illuminating faces with an orange glow. The air grew colder, too cold for June. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, shivering. Then I heard it. A soft tapping coming from the bedroom down the hall. At first I thought it was someone outside or maybe an animal, but the sound was too deliberate, rhythmic. Tap! 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 Slow and steady, like someone knocking on a door. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Everyone nodded, eyes wide. Jenna shook her head. "Probably a rat or something." The tapping continued. We got up and moved toward the bedroom. The hall was narrow, and the candlelight barely pushed back the darkness. The walls seemed to close in, and the air thickened with tension. When we reached the bedroom door, the tapping stopped. We looked at each other, unsure whether to open the door. Jenna reached out, gripping the knob and slowly turning it. The door creaked open, revealing an empty room. The bed was neatly made, but there was something odd. On the pillow lay a single folded note. I bent down and picked it up. It was a piece of plain white paper with just 2 words scribbled in shaky handwriting: "Help me." A chill ran down my spine. No one had been in the bedroom all night. "Maybe a prank?" someone suggested, but their voice wavered. We searched the room, no sign of anyone else, no evidence that someone had been hiding there. Jenna's apartment was locked tight. Suddenly, the temperature dropped even more. Our breaths were visible in the candlelight. The old building groaned, and the floor beneath our feet felt cold and damp. From the far corner of the room, I heard whispering. It was soft, like voices just at the edge of hearing. "Did you hear that?" I asked, heart pounding. The others nodded again, frozen. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, some words barely understandable. "Please, don't leave. Trapped." We backed out of the bedroom and into the hallway. The candle flames flickered wildly as if reacting to an unseen breeze. A low moan filled the space, a sound like a deep, mournful sigh. Panic crept in. The power was still out. I tried to call for help again, no signal. We decided to leave, to get out of the apartment, but when we reached the front door, it wouldn't budge. It was as if it was locked from the outside. We banged on the door, called out, but no one was around. The windows were all shut tight, locked as they had been all night. Then the whispering started again, louder, filling the apartment. The voices were frantic now, desperate. "Stay, stay, don't go." The candle flames extinguished all at once, plunging us into complete darkness. Then, without warning, the lights flickered back on. Jenna's apartment was exactly as it had been before the outage, no signs of anything unusual. But the note was gone. The front door now swung open easily. We didn't hesitate. We ran out, all the way down the stairs and into the cool night air. We didn't stop running until the building was far behind us. The next day, Jenna called the building manager, who told her the history of the apartment. The previous tenant, a young woman, had disappeared without explanation almost exactly a year ago. Police never found a trace. Some neighbors claimed to hear knocking and whispering in the hallways late at night, but no one had ever dared investigate. Jenna moved out within a week. None of us ever went back. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I swear I can still hear that soft tapping, and if I listen closely, the whispering returns, begging to be heard. Story. The end. The summer was winding down, and with it came that restless energy that only a group of teenagers can feel when school is about to start again. For Jake and his friends, the idea of one last get-together before everything changed was a must. They found the perfect spot, an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, abandoned for years but still standing. Jake's cousin had recently inherited it, and with no one living there yet, it seemed like the ideal place to throw their after-party. The house was big but worn down, with cracked windows and faded paint peeling off the wooden siding. Inside, the floorboards creaked underfoot, and dust coated every surface like a thin blanket of neglect. But at night, with the right lights and music, it had the kind of eerie charm that made it exciting. They planned the party for a Saturday, starting around 9 and going late into the night. By the time Jake arrived that evening, the sun had already dipped low, casting long shadows over the fields surrounding the house. His friends were already there, setting up speakers, coolers filled with drinks, and strings of colored lights they'd hung from the rafters of the front porch. The smell of cut grass and wood smoke mixed with the faint scent of mildew from the house's interior. People started arriving just after 9. Kids from school, some they barely knew, others lifelong friends. The music was loud, laughter and voices bouncing off the walls, spilling out onto the porch and into the yard. It was the kind of night where anything seemed possible, where the dark held promises of adventure. As the party picked up, Jake noticed a few people wandering off into the darker corners of the property. The woods behind the house were dense and silent, almost unnaturally still except for the occasional rustle of leaves. Some of the older kids dared each other to explore the woods, but most kept close to the house and fire pit. Jake found himself leaning against the old oak tree near the edge of the yard, talking with Maya and Tyler. Maya had this uneasy look in her eyes that Jake hadn't noticed before. She kept glancing toward the house as if expecting something. "Are you okay?" Jake asked. She shook her head slowly. "I don't know. There's something off about this place. I keep hearing things." "Like what?" Tyler teased. "Footsteps, whispering. But when I look, no one's there." Jake chuckled nervously. "It's an old house, Maya. Probably just the wind." But even as he said it, a sudden chill crawled up his spine. Around midnight, the party started to wind down. Groups thinned out and the music grew quieter. Jake noticed Maya had disappeared. He figured she'd gone to get some air or maybe left early, but when he went looking for her, she wasn't outside or inside. He asked around, but no one had seen her leave. Tyler shrugged it off, saying she probably just slipped out the back. Still uneasy, Jake went into the house to check. The old floorboards groaned under his feet as he moved through the darkened rooms. Most of the party guests were outside or in the main living room, but Maya wasn't anywhere to be found. Then Jake heard it, a faint tapping coming from the basement. The basement door was old, with rusty hinges and a lock that had been broken long ago. He hesitated, but pulled it open. A cold blast of air hit his face, smelling like damp earth and decay. He grabbed his phone flashlight and stepped down the creaking stairs. The basement was vast and cluttered with forgotten furniture and old boxes. The beam from his flashlight flicked across the walls and landed on something that made his blood run cold. A message scrawled in what looked like dark red paint across the concrete wall, words barely legible but unmistakable. "Don't stay." A loud crash sounded behind him, making him jump. He spun around, phone trembling in his hand, but there was nothing there. He hurried back up, heart pounding, and as he reached the top step, he saw a shadow dart across the hallway. "Maya?" he called out, but the silence was deafening. When he got back to the main floor, he told Tyler and a few others what he'd seen. They laughed nervously and said it was probably some prank by one of the kids. But Jake wasn't so sure. Later that night, as the last few guests were leaving, Jake found himself alone in the living room with Maya. She was sitting on the couch, pale and quiet. "You scared me," Jake said, relieved. She looked up, eyes wide with fear. "I went into the basement. I saw something." Before he could ask what, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. Phones came out, flashlights flickered on, but the sense of dread was overwhelming. Then came the whispering. Soft, unintelligible at first, growing louder, as if a crowd of voices surrounded them. Jake grabbed Maya's hand, and they ran outside into the cold night air. The whispers followed. They stopped by the fire pit, but the flames had all but died. Then Jake saw it, standing just beyond the firelight, a figure. It was a woman, translucent and shimmering, her eyes hollow, her face twisted in sorrow. She reached out with a hand that looked like smoke. Jake and Maya froze. Then she spoke, voice barely more than a breath. "You shouldn't have come back." Suddenly, the air turned frigid, and Jake felt his legs give out. He woke up the next morning on the porch, alone. The house was silent. Maya was gone. He searched for her everywhere, but she had vanished without a trace. In the days that followed, the house was boarded up. Rumors spread of a curse tied to the land and the woman who had died there long ago, searching for peace. Jake never went back. But sometimes when the wind blows just right, he hears the whisper in his ear, "Don't stay." Story the end. It was supposed to be just another after party, a small gathering of friends winding down after the main event. The kind of night that starts with laughter, music softly fading, and ends with sleepy conversations that trail off into the early morning. But that night didn't end as any of us expected. I remember arriving late, around 1:30 a.m. at Ryan's apartment. It was one of those converted warehouse lofts on the edge of the old industrial district downtown. High ceilings, exposed brick, big windows with a faint view of the empty streets below. Ryan had moved in only a few weeks before and was eager to show off the space, even if it wasn't completely ready. The paint was peeling in spots, the floors creaked a little more than you'd want, and there was a faint musty smell, like the whole place hadn't quite shaken off its past. Most people had already left when I got there, but there were about 6 of us still sprawled around the living room. Some were dozing on the worn couches. Others sat around the coffee table cluttered with empty bottles and cigarette packs. The air was thick with smoke and the kind of tired contentment that comes after a night of drinking and music. Ryan was telling some half-forgotten story about how the place used to be a factory back in the 40s. Apparently there was a fire that had broken out and a worker had died in the blaze, though Ryan didn't know the details. I think most of us were half listening, eyes glazing over, but then the power flickered. It was brief, just a flicker, but enough to make us all pause. The dim orange glow from the streetlights outside spilled through the windows, casting long shadows on the exposed brick walls. "Old wiring," Ryan said with a shrug, but the slight unease in his voice didn't go unnoticed. The conversation picked back up, but the mood had shifted. The flicker had broken something, like the night had suddenly reminded us that this building held memories, some of them maybe not so good. A few minutes later, the music cut out entirely. Someone must have knocked the plug loose or the breaker had tripped. There was a brief murmur of annoyance, then Ryan got up to check the fuse box in the hallway. The hallway was narrow, lined with peeling wallpaper that was cracked and yellowed with age. I followed Ryan out just to keep him company. As he fiddled with the fuse box, the silence was broken by a faint noise, soft, but definitely footsteps. Slow, deliberate pacing just beyond the far end of the hallway, past the closed door to the storage closet. We froze. Probably someone else in the building, Ryan whispered, or the neighbors. But the building was mostly empty at this hour. We'd checked earlier and no one else was supposed to be there. The footsteps stopped. Then a door creaked open, the storage closet door. Neither of us moved. The closet was pitch dark inside, but you could just make out the shape of old boxes and dust-covered shelving. Ryan took a slow step forward and then paused, as if waiting for something. Then, from inside the closet, a whisper. Soft, barely audible, almost like a sigh. It sent a chill down my spine. "Hello?" Ryan called softly. No reply. We backed away from the closet and rejoined the others, trying to laugh it off. But the whispering seemed to follow us back into the living room. Faint, indistinct, like someone muttering just out of hearing range. I sat down heavily, trying to ignore it. Minutes passed. The power flickered again. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. A cold so sudden and deep that I pulled my jacket tighter around me, my breath visible in the dim light. The whispering grew louder, closer. From the corner of the room I saw her, a figure standing by the window. She was faint, almost translucent. A young woman in a soaked white dress, hair tangled and dripping as if she'd just come out of the water. Her eyes were dark voids, empty, yet somehow filled with sorrow. I blinked, and she was gone. Panic rippled through the group. "Did you see that?" Amanda whispered, her voice shaking. Ryan nodded, swallowing hard. "We need to get out of here." But as we moved toward the front door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. The lock clicked, and no matter how we tried, it wouldn't budge. The whispering turned into a low moan, filling the room, pressing in on us like a physical force. The woman appeared again, closer this time, gliding toward us silently, feet never touching the floor. The air turned icy. I felt a cold touch on my arm, like a warning. Amanda screamed. The figure faded just as suddenly as she had appeared, and the door burst open. We spilled out into the early morning air, gasping for breath, hearts pounding. Ryan never went back to that apartment. Weeks later, I looked up the history of the building. A woman who worked there decades ago had drowned in the flooded basement during a heavy storm. Her body was never found. I still get chills when I think about that night, the feeling that we weren't just scared, but visited by something trapped, sorrowful, and restless. The after party was over, but the haunting was just beginning. Story the end. The after party started like any other typical weekend gathering among friends, but by the end of the night, everything changed in ways none of us could explain or wanted to remember. It was late September, and the air had that sharpness that signals the end of summer, but not quite the chill of fall. College had just begun its second month, and the semester was settling into a rhythm. But for us, it was still a time of careless freedom. I just turned 21, and with that came a new confidence in partying. My best friend Kevin had convinced me to come along to a party at a house on the edge of town, one of those old houses that looked like it had been there for centuries, surrounded by towering trees and a fence that was barely standing. Kevin's friend, Josh, had rented the place for the weekend. The guy was wealthy, kept to himself mostly, but for some reason loved to throw these wild get-togethers where the music blasted and no one thought twice about noise complaints. This one was billed as an after-party after a big concert downtown, and most of the people there had already been drinking for hours. The place was packed with people I barely knew, and the music was loud enough that talking required shouting. I didn't know much about the house before we got there. It was a sprawling Victorian-style place with peeling paint and sagging porches, the kind that looked like it was holding itself together by sheer will. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of smoke and cheap cologne, and every floorboard groaned under the weight of the crowd. The party moved quickly through the night. Drinks flowed freely, and people danced and laughed, trying to drown out the hum of the late hour. Kevin disappeared shortly after we arrived, claiming he wanted to find some quiet space. I wasn't surprised. He wasn't really the party type. By 1 a.m., the house was beginning to thin out. The initial frenzy gave way to a more subdued crowd, small clusters of people sitting on the creaky couches or gathered around the fireplace. I found myself talking to a girl named Rachel, someone I'd met before but never really connected with. We shared a few drinks and stories, and it felt nice, normal, in contrast to the chaos elsewhere. At some point, Rachel mentioned she wanted to explore the upstairs, which was off limits to most guests. Josh had told people it was private, but there was something about the mystery that pulled us toward the creaky wooden staircase at the back of the house. She said she'd always been fascinated by old houses and their secrets. Against my better judgment, I agreed to follow her up. The stairs were narrow and steep, the walls lined with faded wallpaper peeling at the edges. The air upstairs was colder, heavier, and smelled faintly of damp wood and something else I couldn't place. As we reached the top, the music downstairs faded into a dull thump, swallowed by the thick walls. The hallway was lined with several doors, most closed. Rachel pulled one open at the end of the hall. It was a bedroom, dark except for the moonlight filtering through cracked curtains. The furniture was old and draped in sheets, as if frozen in time. She started flipping through a dusty photo album left on the nightstand, showing me black and white pictures of a family, smiling parents, 2 kids, all dressed in clothes from the 1940s. The names written inside the album were faded, but the last page had a note written in shaky handwriting. "We are watching. You should leave." I laughed nervously, thinking it was some kind of prank left by the previous renters. Rachel's eyes were wide, her smile gone. We decided to head back downstairs. As we descended, the sound of footsteps echoed behind us, slow, deliberate. We stopped and looked back, but the hallway was empty. "Probably just the old house settling," I said, forcing a smile. Back on the main floor, the party had thinned even more. Kevin was nowhere to be seen. I texted him a few times, but got no reply. Rachel suggested we head outside for some fresh air. The backyard was overgrown with an old wooden fence that barely held back the darkness of the woods beyond. We sat on the porch steps, the night cool and quiet around us. Then the first strange thing happened. A soft whisper floated through the trees, too faint to make out words, but definitely voices. We both froze, staring into the shadows. "Probably just the wind," Rachel said, but her voice lacked conviction. Suddenly, the lights inside the house flickered and died, plunging everything into darkness. The music stopped. Phones came out, their screens casting eerie glows. That's when the knocking started. It was coming from the side of the house. 3 sharp raps, then a pause, then 3 more. We exchanged glances, the kind that said we both felt the same unease. I got up to check, but before I reached the door, the knocking changed. Fast and furious, like frantic banging. The fence creaked as if something heavy was pressing against it. I called out, "Is someone there?" But only the silence answered. Rachel grabbed my arm, eyes wide. Suddenly a cold wind swept across the yard, making the leaves rustle like whispered warnings. We went back inside, locking the door behind us. The house was cold now, the warmth of the party replaced by a chill that seemed to seep into our bones. Inside, the knocking continued, now from inside the walls. We followed the sound to the living room, where the wallpaper was stained and peeling. The knocks seemed to move along the wall, tracing a path toward the fireplace. Rachel pointed and said, "Look." A small section of the wall near the baseboard began to shift, like something was trying to push through from the other side. We stepped back, hearts racing. Suddenly, the fireplace flared to life, flames roaring without any wood or fuel. The room filled with the smell of smoke and something metallic, like rusted iron. Then a figure appeared in the corner of the room. At first, I thought it was someone standing in shadow, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was translucent. A pale woman in a long, tattered dress, her hair hanging loose and her eyes hollow. Rachel screamed, and I felt frozen, unable to look away. The figure didn't move, but seemed to watch us with a sad, mournful gaze. Then, as suddenly as she appeared, she vanished, and the flames died down. The house fell silent again, the only sound our ragged breathing. We tried to leave, but the front door wouldn't open. No matter how hard we pushed or pulled, it was stuck fast. Panic set in. We called out for Josh and the others, but no one answered. The knocking inside the walls grew louder, faster, now almost a pounding. We decided to check the basement, hoping for another exit. The stairs were steep and dark, and the air grew colder with every step. At the bottom, we found a door we hadn't noticed before. Old, wooden, and covered in strange symbols drawn in chalk. Rachel touched the door, and it swung open with a creak. Inside was a small room, empty except for a single chair in the center. Sitting on the chair was a man's old-fashioned jacket, stained and torn. Suddenly, a voice whispered from the darkness, "Leave." We bolted up the stairs, the door slamming shut behind us. Back upstairs, the windows were rattling, and shadows moved just beyond the glass. The knocking stopped. Instead, the house settled back into silence. By dawn, the front door finally gave way, and we ran out into the morning light, breathless and shaken. Josh was never found, and Kevin resurfaced days later with no memory of what happened that night. I haven't been able to step inside that house again, but sometimes late at night I swear I hear knocking, soft, urgent, and I see faint lights flickering in the distance. Some places hold on to the past more tightly than others, and some secrets are best left undisturbed. Story the end. It started as a typical weekend after party, the kind that most college students know well. The loud music, the crowd packed into a small space, and the lingering haze of alcohol mixed with the nervous excitement of youth. The house we chose was old and a bit rundown, located on the edge of town near the train tracks. None of us really knew much about its history, except that it had been empty for years, before someone in our circle of friends managed to get the owner's permission to use it for the weekend. The first few hours went exactly as expected. Drinks flowed freely, people danced and laughed, and the smell of smoke mingled with the aroma of cheap beer. We were a group of close friends, about 20 or so in all, from various parts of the campus, some from dorms, some off-campus apartments, and it felt like one big reunion. I was there with Alex, Casey, and Jordan, my closest friends since freshman year, and our plan was to stay late, enjoy the party, and maybe crash on the couch if we got too tired. As the night wore on, the energy grew more intense. The music got louder, the conversations more slurred, and the group thinner as some people drifted away or slipped into quiet corners. Around midnight, the power in the house started flickering. We didn't pay much attention at first. It was an old place with old wiring, and a few flickers were normal, especially with all the people draining the electrical circuits. Then, suddenly, the lights cut out entirely. There was a collective groan, but no panic. A few people pulled out their phones for light. Someone shouted a joke about the house finally deciding it didn't want to party anymore. The music stopped, and in the sudden quiet, the weight of the dark felt heavier than expected. It was then that we noticed the sound. At first, it was subtle, a faint tapping, like footsteps coming from upstairs. The house had 2 floors, but only the main level and basement were really used during the party. Most of us hadn't even seen the upper floor or the rooms up there. The stairway was narrow, the wooden steps creaking under any weight. Alex, always the curious one, decided to investigate. "Probably just the old house settling," he said as he grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the stairs. Casey and I followed, feeling a mix of boredom and nervous curiosity. The others stayed behind in the darkened living room, their voices muffled through the thick walls. As we climbed the stairs, the tapping grew louder, more rhythmic, like someone pacing back and forth. When we reached the top, the air was noticeably colder. I could see my breath in the flashlight's beam, which was strange for early spring. The hallway was lined with peeling wallpaper, faded floral patterns curling at the edges. The floorboards creaked softly beneath us. At the end of the hall, a door stood slightly ajar, the source of the tapping. We hesitated but pushed it open. The room was empty except for an old rocking chair, slowly moving back and forth, creaking softly. Casey laughed nervously. "Someone's messing with us," she said, but there was no sign of anyone. Alex stepped forward, reaching for the chair, and it suddenly stopped. The temperature in the room dropped further, and a thick silence fell. Then, faintly at first, we heard it. A whisper, almost inaudible. "Leave." We all froze. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Leave." Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind us, and the flashlight flickered out, plunging us into darkness. Panic surged through me. I fumbled for my phone, turning on its flashlight aft, but the beam barely penetrated the pitch-black room. We tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. Then something cold brushed past my arm, a coldness like nothing I'd ever felt, as if ice was running down my skin. The rocking chair began moving again, faster, back and forth, creaking in a way that felt angry, desperate. A low, guttural moan filled the room, growing louder and louder. Then the whisper turned into a voice, clear and chilling. Go, before it's too late. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on. The door swung open and we scrambled out into the hallway, breathing heavily. When we got downstairs, the party was in chaos. People were panicked, shouting about strange noises, doors slamming on their own, and shadows moving in the corners of their eyes. Someone said they'd seen a figure standing at the edge of the room, pale, with dark eyes and dripping hair. I found Jordan near the kitchen, white as a sheet. "You guys saw it, right?" he asked, voice shaking. We nodded. I tried to leave earlier, but the front door wouldn't open, like it was stuck. We all realized something was very wrong. Then the power went out again. This time it stayed off. We decided to gather everyone and get out, but when we went to the front door, it wouldn't budge. Not a single inch. Panic turned into terror. We banged on windows, shouted for help, but the house swallowed our voices. People began to sob, some prayed, others screamed for someone to answer. Hours passed. The coldness crept into our bones, and then the whispers started, all around us. Stay. Forever. The old house had trapped us. It was dawn when the door finally gave way. We stumbled out, gasping for fresh air. The neighbors had called the cops after hearing the commotion. When police arrived, they found us delirious on the lawn, clothes torn, eyes wild. They searched the house but found no signs of anyone else. No footprints upstairs, no evidence of intruders. But when they checked the basement, they found something chilling. A dusty old diary belonging to a girl named Mary, who had lived there over a century ago. Her last entry spoke of a tragic betrayal. Her fiancé had locked her in the attic during a storm, leaving her to die. Her spirit was said to haunt the house, angry and trapped. None of us wanted to talk about the party after that. Some moved away, others never went near that house again. Every now and then, I still get calls from friends who were there, late at night. They say they hear the whispers, and sometimes when the power flickers just right, they see the rocking chair move on its own. I don't go to parties anymore. Because some places, some nights, aren't meant for the living. Story the end. The night had settled into a warm stillness, the kind that drapes itself over small towns on late summer evenings. The sort of night when the air is thick with the hum of cicadas and the distant glow of porch lights flickers like soft warnings. For Emma and her group of friends, this night was supposed to be a celebration, a last hurrah before everyone scattered for college. They had found the perfect location, an old rental house on the edge of town, empty for years, but recently reopened by a local family. It was big enough to hold their crowd, rustic enough to feel like an adventure. The house sat just beyond the last streetlight, where the pavement faded into cracked gravel and wild grass. At first glance, it was charming in a weathered sort of way, with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch sagging in the middle. Emma's friends had brought in speakers, coolers, and strings of colored lights that they draped over the porch railing and through the trees. The mood was light, laughter spilling into the quiet as people trickled in, greeting old classmates and sharing inside jokes. Inside, the house smelled like dust and forgotten memories, the wooden floors groaning underfoot, settling sounds that seemed almost alive in the night. Emma liked the place. It was like stepping into a time capsule, a perfect backdrop for a night they'd remember forever. By 11, the party was in full swing. Music pulsed through the rooms, the bass rattling the windows. People danced and mingled, voices rising and falling like waves. Emma found herself near the kitchen with her best friend Nate, sipping a soda and watching the crowd. "We should check out the back," Nate said suddenly, nodding toward the yard. "I heard there's a fire pit and some trails into the woods." Emma hesitated. The woods behind the house had always given her an uneasy feeling, a place that seemed to swallow sound and light. But she nodded. "Let's go." Outside, the fire pit crackled, casting flickering shadows on faces warmed by the flames. Around the fire, smaller groups had gathered, some roasting marshmallows, others just talking quietly. The woods loomed just beyond, black and silent, the trees swaying slightly in a breeze that carried a hint of coldness. Nate and Emma wandered toward the tree line, the laughter behind them fading as the night deepened. The air was cool, and Emma pulled her jacket tighter. "I don't like this," she admitted. "Feels like we're being watched." Nate laughed. "You've been watching too many horror movies. It's just the woods." As they stood there, a rustling came from the bushes to their left. Both jumped, turning toward the sound. "Hello?" Nate called, shining his phone flashlight toward the noise. Nothing. They shrugged it off and headed back to the party, but the feeling stayed with Emma. Around midnight, the music had softened, and many guests were starting to drift away. Emma noticed Nate had disappeared. She asked around, but no one had seen him leave. Growing worried, she checked the house but found no sign of him. Then she heard it, the faint sound of footsteps upstairs. Emma froze. She'd been told the upstairs bedrooms were locked and empty, yet the sound was unmistakable. Slow, deliberate steps pacing the hallway. She called out, "Nate?" No answer. Swallowing her fear, Emma climbed the stairs, each creak echoing louder than it should in the silent house. At the top, the hallway stretched dark and cold. The doors to the bedrooms were shut, but one, at the far end, was slightly ajar. Emma pushed it open, flashlight trembling in her hand. The room was empty, except for a small chair facing the window. The curtains fluttered in the breeze, revealing a pale face reflected in the glass, a woman with dark, haunted eyes staring back at Emma. She gasped and stumbled back. The door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Emma pounded on the door, heart racing. Suddenly, a whisper brushed past her ear. "You shouldn't be here." She fled downstairs, gasping for air. Outside, the party was nearly over. Friends were packing up, some shivering in the cooling air. Emma grabbed her phone to call Nate, but the screen was dead. In the distance, a figure stood just beyond the yard's edge, where the light faded into shadow. Emma squinted. The woman from the window was there, her face pale and sorrowful, watching silently. Frozen, Emma couldn't move. Then the figure vanished into the woods. Emma ran back inside to gather her friends. They found Nate asleep on the couch, pale and sweating, muttering about shadows and whispers. The next day, they learned the house had a tragic history, a woman who had died alone upstairs decades before, her spirit rumored to haunt the place, searching for peace. No one wanted to return. Emma never forgot the night when the past reached out from the darkness and whispered warnings she couldn't ignore. Story the end. The after party started as a casual wind down, a few friends hanging around in the living room of my friend Jake's apartment after a big night out. The main party had been wild, loud music, dancing, and way too many people packed into his small downtown loft, but now only a handful of us remained. We were spread out across the threadbare couches and the floor, nursing drinks, talking quietly, and waiting for the first hints of dawn. Jake's apartment was in an old building that had been converted from a warehouse decades ago. High ceilings, exposed pipes, and huge industrial windows that faced a deserted alleyway gave the place a certain character, but also a strange feeling of being exposed and empty. I had been to a few parties there before, and while the space was cool, it always had this slightly unsettling vibe, especially late at night. Tonight, though, after the main crowd had left, it felt heavier somehow. It was around 2:30 a.m., and only 4 of us were left. Jake, his girlfriend Emma, my friend Sam, and me. The others had either crashed on couches or already left. We were sitting around the living room floor, talking in low voices, the music replaced by soft jazz playing from the speakers. Jake was telling a story about the previous tenants of the building. Apparently, decades ago, it had been a textile factory, and there was a fire that had claimed several lives. One of the victims was a young woman, a seamstress who was trapped on the upper floors and never made it out. Her name was supposedly Clara. Jake said that sometimes people reported hearing strange noises late at night, footsteps, or the sound of sewing machines running when the building was supposed to be empty. I remember thinking it was the usual urban legend stuff. The kind of thing people say to spice up a party story. But the way Jake said it had a serious tone that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Suddenly, the lights flickered once, then went out completely. The apartment was plunged into darkness. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Emma reached for her phone and switched on the flashlight app, holding it up to the ceiling. The soft glow revealed our faces, startled and uneasy. Jake got up and walked toward the breaker box near the kitchen, his footsteps echoing in the silence. "Probably just the old wiring," he said. "I'll fix it." Sam and I stayed behind, sitting close together, watching the shadows move on the walls. The air felt thick and cold, colder than it should have been for a late spring night. As Jake bent down to check the breakers, I heard a faint noise behind us, a soft thump, like someone dropping something heavy. I turned toward the sound, expecting to see one of the cats Jake's neighbor kept, but there was nothing. Emma whispered, "Did you hear that?" "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. The thumping came again, this time followed by a dragging sound, like fabric being pulled across the floor. Jake stood up, heading toward the living room, flashlight in hand. The beams swept across the floor, the furniture, and the walls. "Weird," he muttered. "Nothing here." Then, from the corner near the window, I caught movement out of the edge of my vision. A figure, almost transparent, wearing a long white dress, standing perfectly still, watching us. I blinked, and it was gone. "Did anyone else see that?" I asked, voice barely above a whisper. Emma nodded, clutching her sweater tightly. "Yes, there was someone there." Jake looked pale. "I didn't see anything. Maybe the light's messing with our eyes." But as he said that, the room grew even colder. A shiver ran down my spine. The smell of something old and musty filled the air, like damp fabric left in a forgotten attic for decades. Then the faint sound of a sewing machine began to hum, rhythmic and steady, coming from the hallway outside the living room. "Okay, that's definitely not normal," Sam said, standing up. We all looked toward the hallway. The sewing machine noise grew louder, interspersed with faint whispering, like someone talking in a language none of us could understand. Emma's face went pale. "We should leave." Jake nodded, but as he moved toward the door, it slammed shut with a force that made the whole apartment shake. The lights flickered back on. The sewing stopped. We were frozen in place. A cold breeze swept through the room, though every window was closed. Then, from the hallway, a soft tapping began, like fingernails tapping on wood. The tapping grew louder, faster. Jake tried to open the door, but it was locked tight. The tapping suddenly stopped. Then a voice, low, female, barely audible, whispered, "Don't leave." Emma screamed. The lights cut out again, plunging us into total darkness. We heard footsteps running down the hallway toward us, and then a whisper, so close it was right in my ear, "Stay." Then a hand, cold, clammy, grabbed my wrist. I yanked away, heart pounding. The lights flickered back on once more. Jake slammed his fist against the door. "Let us out!" he shouted. Suddenly the door unlocked and swung open. We didn't hesitate. We ran out into the night, breathing hard, not daring to look back. Jake never stayed at that apartment again. Weeks later, I looked up the history of the building. A young seamstress named Clara had died in a fire there in the 1940s. Her body was never recovered. Neighbors said they sometimes saw a woman in white wandering the hallways at night, sewing silently. I still get chills thinking about that after party, how what started as a casual wind down turned into something I explained, something that wasn't ready to move on. Story the end. The night had started out as a typical weekend after party. Just a small group of friends winding down after a concert downtown. The air was heavy with the scent of spilled beer, cigarettes, and the faint traces of a night's worth of laughter. We were all in that hazy place where the music and the alcohol mixed into a kind of warm blur, and nothing felt like it mattered except the moment. It was the kind of night that promised fun, but for me, would soon unravel into something deeply unsettling, something I still struggle to explain. It all began when we arrived at the house, a rambling old Victorian on the outskirts of the city. Josh had rented it for the weekend. Cheap, thanks to a friend of a friend, and it was perfect for a small group. The house creaked in that old-fashioned way that makes you feel like you're being watched, even if you know it's just the wood settling. The peeling wallpaper and faded floral curtains made it clear this place hadn't been touched in decades. Still, it had character, and Josh insisted it added to the vibe. We were about 12 in total, friends from college and a few others Josh had invited. The main room was crowded and loud, music blasting from a beaten-up stereo in the corner. People danced, talked, and moved between rooms, voices overlapping into one constant hum. It was around midnight when the crowd began to thin. most people slipping out to catch the last bus or call it a night. By 1 a.m., only a handful of us remained. Josh, my best friend Mark, a girl named Claire, and me. The party had turned quiet, the noise now just a soft echo through the old walls. We sat around in a circle in the dim living room, the only light coming from a flickering candle Josh had found on the dusty mantelpiece. That's when Josh mentioned the attic. "I heard this place has a creepy history," he said with a grin. "Some old woman died here years ago. They say her ghost still wanders around upstairs." I laughed, brushing it off, but Mark looked interested. "Want to check it out?" he asked. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The others joined us, curiosity winning over caution. We found the narrow staircase at the back of the house, covered in dust and cobwebs. The steps groaned under our feet as we climbed into the darkness. At the top, the attic was small and cluttered, old furniture draped in white sheets, trunks piled in the corners, and a single window letting in a sliver of moonlight. The air was colder here, stale and thick with dust. We shone our phones around, the beams catching framed photographs, cracked porcelain dolls, and a faded diary lying open on a wooden crate. Claire picked up the diary and began to read aloud. It belonged to a woman named Evelyn, who had lived in the house during the 1920s. The entries told of loneliness, despair, and strange happenings, unexplained noises, shadowy figures moving just out of sight, and a growing sense of being watched. Suddenly, the candle downstairs flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. We all froze. From below, the faint sound of knocking echoed through the floorboards, slow, deliberate, rhythmic. Mark laughed nervously. Probably just the wind. But I wasn't convinced. The knocking grew louder, now joined by a faint whispering, like voices murmuring from the walls. A cold breeze swept through the attic, sending chills down our spines. Claire gasped, dropping the diary. The window slammed shut on its own, and the whispering stopped abruptly. We hurried down the stairs, the air thick with tension. The knocking followed us, moving through the walls like a heartbeat. Back in the living room, Josh tried to light another candle, but the match snapped in his hand. The temperature dropped sharply, our breath visible in the cold air. Then, from the corner of the room, a shadow flickered. I turned, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. "Did you see that?" Claire whispered. Before anyone could answer, the front door slammed shut. We rushed to open it, but it was stuck fast, as if something was holding it closed. Panic set in. We searched for another way out, but all windows were sealed tight. The knocking grew frantic now, pounding against the walls in a relentless rhythm. Then the music from the stereo downstairs started playing, distorted and slowed, a haunting melody that filled the room with dread. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on. In the doorway stood a woman, pale, eyes hollow, wearing a tattered dress stained with dirt and age. She didn't move but stared directly at us, her gaze filled with sorrow and anger. Mark tried to speak, but no words came out. The woman vanished as suddenly as she had appeared, leaving behind an oppressive silence. We didn't sleep that night. At dawn, the door finally unlocked, and we fled the house without looking back. In the days that followed, strange things continued. Mark disappeared for 2 days, found wandering near the old cemetery with no memory of how he got there. Claire called to say she felt watched in her own apartment. Josh refused to talk about what happened. As for me, I've never been able to shake the feeling that something followed me home that night, a presence lurking just beyond the edges of my vision. I know what I saw wasn't just a trick of the mind or a product of too much alcohol. It was real. And some nights, when the wind is just right, I can still hear that knocking. Slow, deliberate, and waiting. Story, the end.